Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video. Myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war hits and losses addendum. It's an appendix to the last few weeks, really, certainly the last week or so of losses. And Andrew Perpetua's loss list, he has released 3 of them from way back when, from the 8th, the 9th and the 10th of January. We're now the 17th. Is there any point in me going through these? Probably not, but I do like to do it. So I'm going to share it with you. Why not? And some of you find this interesting. So we're going to look at the 3 days of loss lists and see whether we can derive any conclusions, any trends from the losses that both sides had taken on those 3 days. And remember, these days don't necessarily correlate one-to-one with what was lost the day before. In fact, they almost certainly don't. These losses are published and they get on the socials, and Andrew Perpetua and his team pick them up, but it doesn't mean that it happened the day before. It might have even been months before with some of these bits and pieces. Now, if we're looking at the numbers of personnel lost for each day, 191 for the 8th, 134 for the 9th and 208 for the 10th. So some couple of really significant days of personnel losses caught on video. And remember, you know, when you're losing that many people a day, according to the general staff figures. So today's numbers were sort of what, 1,570 was it? That you're only going to catch like a small proportion of that on the socials, but I think even to catch around 200 people a day shows you the huge numbers of losses that the Russians must be taking. And of course, we can argue the same for the Ukrainians, but in terms of the Russian losses, they are phenomenal. Now we go to the 8th, we can see there's about parity for the two sides there. In terms of combat asset losses, about parity again. So only the Russians losing maybe a few more civilian bits of kit than the Ukrainians, and that probably tips them over to slightly more losses in total. If we look at the Ukrainian losses, anything significant? Well, in terms of the proportion of abandoned and destroyed to damaged, fairly bad for the Ukrainians there. Most of them, specifically in the IFV, APC, MRAP kind of categories, are irretrievably lost. We have T-64 tanks and no Western tanks there, so that's good. We have, unfortunately, 2 Bradleys on the list, American provided Bradleys, destroyed, abandoned, then hit by different, I don't know what that second one is, a VAAA, but the first one hit by a drone dropped incendiary bomb, so that's what happens when they get abandoned, unfortunately. 3 strikers on the list there, and some Western provided MRAPs or indigenously built MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles, and some other Western vehicles too. So quite a few bits of Western kit, but like I've said before, although it's bad to see Bradleys on the list, these are their kind of best infantry fighting vehicles, arguably. You can argue whether the CV90s provided by the Swedish are better than Bradleys. The result, you can either say, right, this is bad because they're losing their best stuff, or it's good that they are using their best stuff in order to lose it, rather than using crappier vehicles and losing like BMP-1s that you see there. So is it better that you see Bradleys than BMP-1s on the list? I don't know. You can make a case for either. Okay, then going to the Russian losses. So definitely more Russian losses, but as mentioned, that's from the civilian vehicles mainly. Artillery pieces, normal sort of D30s and a few other bits and pieces. Tanks, half dozen tanks there. 1 tracked garden shed, but otherwise mainly nondescript. Like the Ukrainians, most of these, almost all of them, destroyed and abandoned, so irretrievably lost. We've got about almost 10 infantry fighting vehicles, old BMP-1s, 2s, and the occasional 3, and a few BTRs in, and then some APCs as well. A few buggies. So nothing too crazy for the 8th. Just losing the typical equipment. There's no air defense systems, nothing of massive value for either side. We'll move on to the 9th, and we'll see that the loss lists, the ratio is about 2-1 now. No, probably about 3, almost 3-1 of overall losses. In terms of combat asset losses, probably 2-1 at most. And then the Russians just losing a lot more ATVs, trucks, and civilian vehicles. But remember, as I keep saying, these vehicles that the Russians are losing here these are combat asset losses. So effectively, they are using buggies to do maneuvers or to deliver troops to the contact line, as they are with these other vehicles, motorcycles and Scooby-Doo vans and all sorts. Right, when we look at the Ukrainian losses, anything particularly notable? There's another Bradley lost in the infantry fighting vehicles, 5 of those, the rest of them BMP 1s and 2s. APCs are all M113s, the old American workhorse there. A few MRAPs, a couple of Humvees, and a few ATVs themselves, a few buggies that the Ukrainians have lost, but nothing too problematic there. For the Russians, just a lot more equipment. So that tells us something, doesn't it? The Russians are just losing a lot of equipment. Artillery pieces. We have a destroyed BM-21 Grad. That's probably, I don't know if that's the one that went hugely bang the other day, because this is dated from the 9th, and actually that one was from the other day. So that's another multiple launch rocket system lost there, and a few other pieces of artillery. A few bits of artillery on that particular day, considering we don't see that much noted and individually confirmed losses. Tracked garden sheds, a few of those, one with a mine roller. We've got some infantry fighting vehicles, so about 10 tanks, about 10 IFVs, and a bunch of nondescript armoured fighting vehicles and APCs and whatnot. And then quite a lot, indeed. Is that over 10 ATVs or thereabouts? Desert Cross 1000-3, these golf buggies that they use, and other nondescript buggies. Almost all of those destroyed, and quite a large number of civilian vehicles too. So again, nothing crazy valuable individually, but taken as a whole, the Russians are losing a lot of equipment. Certainly a lot more than the Ukrainians on that particular day. And then the final sheet that we have looks even worse for the Russians. So it's got progressively worse over these 3 days. It's about a 4-1, maybe 3.5-1 loss ratio, with the Russians losing an inordinate amount of civilian vehicles there and ATVs compared to the Ukrainians. Actually, there's not too much of a difference between the combat asset losses, about equal there. But I possibly signifies here that the Russians are using a lot of those unarmored vehicles for their frontal assaults. We have an electronic warfare system on the Ukrainian list, a few howitzers, 5 tanks, nothing too crazy, mainly T-64s. Infantry fighting vehicles, interesting today that most of them are BMP-1s with the damaged Bradley at the end there. Again, the proportion of destroyed and abandoned to damaged is fairly bad, but it could be worse. MRAPs and APCs, fairly standard number of those. We've got about, if you put the infantry mobility vehicles, things like Humvees. So infantry mobility vehicles do what they say on the tin, which is they move infantry around, but they're not that protected. An MRAP moves infantry around, but it's protected against mines, so the armor is much better, but it doesn't necessarily have big auto cannons on top. Then you're moving to the infantry fighting vehicle, which is something that might have an autocannon, could have even a tow missile like the Bradley. And then you have APCs, which are kind of like MRAPs, but they might have more wheels. MRAPs usually are 4 wheels, 4-wheeled vehicles. APCs, they are armored, they do carry people around. Are they designed specifically to protect against mines? Arguable. Depends how old they are, but some APCs might have a bit of an armament on top of them as well. So there's a bit of a murky area between all these different acronyms and what they mean and how different they are. But you can see here that Ukraine is not losing a fair amount of kit, but nothing too substantial in terms of value, and a fair few pieces of civilian equipment as well, pickup trucks mainly. Then when we look at the Russian losses, my goodness. So a phenomenal amount of civilian vehicles lost, and who knows, but there will be a proportion of that used on the contact line, used in moving troops around the contact line, or even attacking in columns. We have seen unarmored columns, entire columns of pickup trucks and buggies being sent at the Ukrainians. So the Russians losing a huge number there, and a lot of those destroyed as well, about half, but the list is very, very long. When we look at the combat assets, we've got an air defense system, which is, I think that's a Ponge. That's the drone, the Russian drone that I think attacked the North Korean air defense system there, and that's been damaged. I think that's what that refers to. Two recovery vehicles. One is a track garden shed recovery vehicle and an engineering vehicle. We've got a couple of really old howitzers, a D-30 and an M46. And then down to tanks, a couple of track garden sheds again, including one in the infantry fighting vehicle. So these are where they have vehicles. That's what Andrew calls these tracked vehicles that might have once been tanks or infantry fighting vehicles, and they put loads of iron sheeting, metal sheeting on top, and they treat them as glorified people carriers, really, because they often can't move the turrets, which means they could be damaged tanks that they don't send back to get fixed, because actually they prefer infantry mobility vehicles. The main functional need is getting troops from A to B to the contact line to attack on foot, rather than have tanks do tanky things. And so I think they're just not fixing tanks. That vehicle would then be out of action. It'll be sent back and you won't see it for another month or two. They'd much rather say, okay, the turret doesn't work, or we've run out of ammunition, whatever the reason is, barrels shot. But instead, we're going to just put some metal on top of it and turn it into a glorified SUV, MPV, and get our peeps around. And then they get blown up themselves. Infantry fighting vehicles, about 10 of them here, BMPs and whatnot. And then you've got the old tracked APCs, the MTLB, the old tractor of the Russian army. Nothing too crazy. It's that air defense and the recovery vehicles are of note. And then quite a lot, again, another almost 10 ATVs, these golf buggies and quads and whatnot. And then just a huge number of civilian vehicles. So nothing crazy from either side over the course of the 3 days. A few individual pieces of equipment of note, but generally the Russians continuing to lose unsustainable amounts of equipment. Ukrainians losing quite a few combat assets themselves, fairly comparable in the traditional combat assets, your actual tanks, IFVs, APCs, and MRAPs and whatnot. Ukraine is not losing that many fewer pieces of that, but the Russians just absolutely hemorrhaging vehicles in general. And the question is, how long can they sustain that? I guess when you're talking about pickups and whatnot, then there's a lot more scope for being able to nick those off locals, to get those from Russia, than to get the actual the tanks and the IFVs that they're also losing in vast quantities. Anyway, that's enough from me. So that's just a vaguely short synopsis of the losses that we saw on those 3 days. He has many other loss lists to bring out. He's caught up with the 8th, 9th, 10th, and very close to some of these other days, but still there's a backlog there that needs to be worked through. So thanks, Andrew, for all the work that you and your team do, and hopefully we'll see some more of them soon.